Hey folks, the enemy's not at the gates of the city. They're already up on Parliament Hill, deconstructing the bastions of limited constitutional democracy. Please watch this vodcast to the end. You know, I can see the click-through rates on this channel, and it's rather sad because I spend a great deal of effort and time to do the research needed to provide you with vital information. Vital information that you will need to protect yourself from what's coming. All the totalitarian hells mankind could create in the 20th century will be far exceeded by the ideological nightmare presently unfolding. Our weapons of warfare have become so technically advanced to the point where in the past century they would have seemed to be pure fiction, as is our ability to disseminate ideological disinformation via the internet in this post-information age, which is being used to propagate psychological warfare against you. The horror of whatever is unfolding has become unthinkable simply because we cannot imagine it. And October the 7th is proof of that. Today, the fools in government are attempting to equate the traditional values which built Western liberalism with murderous political Islam so that they can decry Israel's right to defend itself against existential peril and unthinkable terror so heinous and hideous that hardened journalists who are used to seeing mayhem have broken down in tears watching the videos of Hamas's holocaustic torture and murder of innocents. So as Remembrance Day approaches, it is my concerted opinion that we need to accept that we will either stand up for what is right today or we will beg on our knees tomorrow. So let's examine the nature of the tolerance the Canadian government is responsible for permitting. Make no mistake, political Islam has no place in Canada or in any other civilized society. From the National Post, an article by Renee Bremer, published November the 7th, 2023, entitled, Quebec Leaders Want Hate Speech Investigation into Imam Calling for Extermination of Zionist Aggressors. Imam gave speech to Montreal crowd calling for extermination of Zionist aggressors. Premier François Legault accused Adil Sharkoui of inciting hate and violence and said he was counting on the police to do their job. Obviously, they didn't. The leaders of Quebec's four main political parties are calling for well-known and controversial Imam Adil Sharkoui to be investigated for possible hate crimes after he delivered a prayer calling for the extermination of Zionist aggressors during a pro-Palestinian demonstration in downtown Montreal. Briefly addressing reporters on his way into question period on Tuesday, Premier François Legault accused Sharkoui of inciting hate and violence and said he was counting on the police to do their job. It's not my place to tell them how to do their job, but inciting violence is not allowed. End from that article. So what PM Trudeau decries, while PM Trudeau decries both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, he fails to mention one extremely important distinction, namely that virtually all persecution of Jews are coming directly from Islamic sources, while there are no instances of Islamophobia being caused by Jews. So I wish to talk about how a fifth column operates to disrupt civil order to create a win for the disruptors. Obviously, since the disruptors causing problems are in the minority, they operate asymmetrically. since their numbers are insufficient to wage a frontal assault. Therefore, they inject themselves into the population they seek to disrupt as a fifth column of agitators, which is why there are no instances of Jewish agitation calling for death to Muslims in Canada, nor are there any Jews who seek to do anything but restore civil order wherever they reside so they can live peacefully and in harmony with their neighbors. At the same time, radical Islamists are demanding that Canada involves itself in their affairs while constantly agitating unrest in our midst. Here I will state something which will make me even more disliked than I already am. If you were to compare the proportion of violent offenders in prison or before the courts in Canada between the Muslim and the Jewish populations, the vast majority will have their origins from the Muslim world. Radical political Islam is not so much a religion of peace, but one of pieces, as in hacked, shot, and blown to pieces. You may not like this, however, I have stated the factual evidence of how they so often fail to assimilate, while the Jews, on the other hand, are often among the most prominent, productive, peaceful, and prosperous citizens in the communities where they reside. So let's look at the definition of a fifth column from Encyclopedia Britannica. It defines them as a clandestine group or faction. Fifth column, clandestine group or faction of subversive agents who are attempting to undermine a nation's solidarity by any means at their disposal. This term is conventionally credited to Emilio Mola Vidal, a national general during the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 39. As 4 of his army columns moved on Madrid, the general referred to his militant supporters within the capital as his fifth column, intent on undermining the loyalist government from within. So, when we look at the history of the 57 Islamic countries in the world, their tactics are always the same. Immigrate, stay calm, multiply, build mosques, establish Islamic associations and organizations, become involved in politics, then take over. A cardinal technique of the fifth column is the infiltration of sympathizers into the entire fabric of a nation under attack, and particularly into positions of policy decision, and national defense. From such key posts, fifth column activists exploit the fears of people by spreading rumors and misinformation, as well as by employing the more standard techniques of espionage and sabotage. And the Canadian government and bureaucracy are rife with such. In Islam, taqiyya, literally prudence or fear, is a precautionary dissimulation or denial of religious belief and practice. Generally, taqiyya is the action of committing a sinful act, such as feigning disbelief, for a pious goal. It is a practice of concealing one's belief and foregoing ordinary religious duties when under perceived threat or to advance their cause clandestinely. The principle of practicing the dissimulation of outward conformity is permitted for Muslims in a non-Muslim environment for the sake of pursuing a higher goal. However, the use of taqiyya varies, especially between the Sunni and Shia Muslims. Now, there are canaries in coal mines all over the place, and for whatever reason, I've always been good at spotting them. Anti-Semitism here in Canada has become the latest bird to fall off its perch, but it has many antecedents in many other places. When I lived in Norway, I witnessed 2 phenomena working to the detriment of Norwegian samfunn, which means society, Norwegian society. First was the cultural demand to march in perfect collectivist conformity, enforced by their version of tall poppy syndrome known as janteloven. Secondly, I watched the government create issue after issue, only to emerge as the only one who could solve a problem which didn't exist until the government had created it. And woe betide the senior bureaucrat, my wife, who was commissioned to solve one of them, since no good deed will ever go unpunished. They operate under the principle that the beatings will continue until morale improves. Immigration was a particular issue that came to my attention as I had chosen to study Norwegian culture and language at the local school, Norskurs, in the town where I was living at the time. It became obvious that although I had a great desire to fit in, that my classmates had no such desire. But there was something far more peculiar, that the authorities resented my presence despite me asking nothing of them other than to process my immigration, since I was paying my own way. It was obvious that the state favored immigrants who received social assistance and yet were the least likely to be assimilated, which has led to immigration becoming a major cultural issue in Scandinavia, perhaps most particularly so in Sweden. I am convinced that importing resentful people from war-torn countries whose value system is utterly unlike Western values can only possibly lead to ruin, and it has. Since Norway had at one time a very homogeneous population, immigration proved to be a major challenge for them. So they provided the canary, which allowed me to predict where Canada was headed, culturally, despite our lack of homogeneity. One thing I noticed is that there were very few Jews left due to the period during World War II under Quisling's puppet Nazi regime. The other thing I noticed is that they appeared not to trust anyone who took what they perceived as too great an interest in their culture, since Hitler had appropriated it as an example of Nordic, Teutonic perfection. He had turned Norway into a baby-making factory. Therefore, I got the distinct impression that they didn't trust me, since I was actually trying to fit in and learn the language. Again, no good deed will go unpunished. Both my country of Canada and my wife's country of Norway have sailed past the point of no return. Our governments have both created economic and cultural policies which include unvetted immigration that is nothing shy of nor short of culturally revolutionary. Both canaries are dead, and my most dire predictions have come home to roost, to sit on the perch where canaries once sat. Our governments cannot sympathize with political Islam and not expect themselves to become anti-Semitic. AP's headquarters in Oslo, the political party of the Norwegian Statsminister, has a Palestinian flag being projected onto the front face of the building. So, since the incredible naivety of the willfully deceived are preventing most of you from watching a mere 20 minutes of my video, which is packed with information that might be used to protect your very way of life, I have no confidence that the air I am blowing toward my video's microphone will do the least bit of good. You see, I can see the click-through rates on my episodes to note that many of you appear to have the attention span of gerbils. Nevertheless, I will be found to be faithful in my duty to warn as many of you as I can that something far worse is coming down the pipeline, for the very reasons that I have warned you that it would. Will you listen? That is between you and your Maker, since I am speaking God's own truth. It might behoove you to heed my admonitions. So as I stated at the beginning of this podcast, Remembrance Day is this coming Saturday. It is my concerted opinion that we need to accept that we will either stand up for what is right today or beg on our knees tomorrow, when we can all say, ha det fint, ha det godt, vi ses så snart som muligt, borta galskapen som overalt. Ha det bra. Vi ses.